All right, welcome back. So we finished the week in Genesis, and I'm going to be honest with you, kind of a doozy of a way to finish the week. We have been looking at Joseph's story. Yesterday, probably the worst part of the Joseph story, when his brothers thought about ending his life, but instead decided to throw him in a pit and then sell him, and the grief that creates for Jacob. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, the Bible lets us sort of live with that cliffhanger a little bit. The last thing we get told in chapter 37 is that he's taken to Egypt and he works for an official, a captain of the guard, and now we have to kind of wait. In order to preserve that suspense a little bit, the Bible inserts another story. Part of that, I think, is to give us a break and build the suspense. I think part of that is also that once we get to the next cycle of Joseph's stories, it's a little bit harder to get a breath in. And so this is the place. We get the story of Judah and Tamar, not an uplifting kind of story, a strange story, but in some ways a unique or at least an unusual story. Right. There are not a ton of stories about strong women working the system. We've seen that from Jacob. We've seen that in some of the Genesis stories, but those have always been men. And here we have a woman who sort of grabs her own destiny and moves forward in a very maybe troubling way, but it is an interesting story. So remember, Judah is one of the older children and of Jacob. And we won't read all of this, but I'll read enough of it to get into the story here. Chapter 38. It happened at that time, Judah went down from his brothers. He settled near a certain place. Verse 2, Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Again, she conceived and bore a son who she named Onan. Again, she bore a son and named him Shelah. She was in Chezib when she bore him. That doesn't matter. So verse 6, Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, go to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law. Raise up her offspring for your brother. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he was with her, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to his daughter Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows. But he feared that he too would die like his brothers, so Tamar went to live in her father's house. So, a very strange story for a lot of reasons, one of which is that there is this custom in ancient Israel that when an older brother or a brother dies, a husband dies, the wife essentially becomes the care and property of the family. And so having not produced children, as the older son as he is deceased, then it becomes the job. She essentially becomes the younger brother's concubine, and it becomes his task then to produce children for his family in his brother's name. This seems very odd to us. It was a way to protect women of sorts. That way, since they had very little options in the world, and having been married once, they may not be likely to be married again. This kept them within a family and kept oversight of them within that family. What, as strange as that is, I think what is most interesting about this text, Michael, is that I think this is really the first time we've seen God's justice delivered instantly. So we get no real commentary on this other than he was wicked. And unlike some of the chapters we've seen where God sort of stands by watching and observing, here God interacts very explicitly and puts him to death.
Yeah, so there's a lot of strange details here, as you've already mentioned here, Clint. Just a couple more to point out. Notice that Judah is marrying a Canaanite, and that is not in this text given any negative connotation, though we see the Canaanites listed as being a negative thing over and over and over again in the Old Testament. That is not here, so we shouldn't put it in there. The text is not making some sort of moral judgment about there being marriages to foreign women here. What we do see, and to your point here, this odd thing that happens where these people are determined explicitly in the text, these sons are determined to be evil. It just says outright, they were evil. It doesn't say why they were evil. There's no accounting for what they did or some action that made them that way. I can't think of another character that we've just been told explicitly in those terms was evil, and then to take it to the next step where it just says they received the capital punishment, that God put them to death for that action. I mean, it's almost perfunctory. It's so simple, and it's just laid out in the narrative. So this is strange. We've not seen absolutely anything like this because we don't have the sense that there's some form of judgment for that original choice to marry a Canaanite woman. We don't really have a sense that these sons have done something in particular to get on the wrong side, that they just were told were evil. So what that does, Clint, is set up the story and interestingly sets up the woman character of this story to really play a pivotal role as the story goes on. The men, in some ways, just right at the front end sort of get placed in positions or roles, and the story is going to carry forward the choices, the very few choices that remain ahead as the story proceeds.
Right. And, the feminist take on this story, I think, is helpful in reminding us that this woman, Tamar, has very few options. She doesn't have a path that she's property. She's handed to the next brother. It's assumed that she has to be okay with that. They clearly sort of live as husband and wife, and yet the younger brother does what he can not to get her pregnant. And I want to point out explicitly that his motivation is that he does not want, he knew that the offspring would not be his. So he doesn't want his brother, he sort of doesn't want to participate in this. Whether this is tension between the brothers, whatever this is, it's not relationship with her. That's happening. But he is avoiding the duty that he has to get her pregnant, and he's doing so evidently because he doesn't want to fulfill his brother's calling. He's having sex with her, but he's trying to prevent the thing that he is supposed to be doing. And so it's a very strange story. And we probably have to mention here, Michael, this story has had a weird history in the church. This story has been used in conversations about fornication and masturbation, and it's not about any of those things. It's about a man breaking the law of God by not fulfilling his duty to his family. You just have to be, when you take this story in those kind of turns, I think you're leaving the path.
So I think that's a helpful word. We need to remember our context here, that we've been in Genesis this whole time. The idea of the heir or the next generation coming has always been framed, person and generation, time and time again. It's been framed from the lens of passing the baton to the next person who will receive the blessing of God, who will experience God's faithfulness. What is happening here is we have a covenantal family relationship where promises has been made, where there's real expectations for what the next step should and needs to be. And we see successively, first, the unwillingness of the brother to meet that next familial expectation, to keep this generation from one to the next going. But then we're going to see that in fear, so this is the same with Judah himself, that he, fearing for his youngest son's life, he does deceive this woman and says to her, when the son is old enough, then Tamar, then you're going to have this promise made, this promise fulfilled. And it seems, I mean, at least the text leaves open, it seems that Judah did not ever plan on that actually following through. He intended for her to go to live in her own father's house and to sort of let her life just sort of go into a dead end. And that is unto itself sort of the next level of, really the breaking of the system, the breaking of the code of what should happen is not happening at all of these different layers of the story.
Yeah, and we tend to emotionalize children, and rightly so, but keep in mind that for a woman in this day and age, children are a future. They're income producers. They can secure for her a home, a place. I mean, a widow without children is a very, very vulnerable position in ancient Israel. And so, anyway, Judah does put her off. His wife dies. Tamar hears that he is traveling, and so she dresses up. She puts on a veil, and I'm in about verse 15 here. As he travels, when Judah saw her, he thought her to be a prostitute, for her face was covered. He went to her on the roadside and said, "Let me come to you," for he did not know that it was his daughter-in-law. She said, "What will you give me?" He answered, "I will send you a kid from my flock." And she said, "Only if you give me a pledge until then." He said, "What could I give you?" And she said, "Your signet and your cord and the staff in your hand." So he gave them to her and went to her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and went away, and taking off her veil, she put on the garments of widowhood. So Tamar makes it a point to know where Judah's going to be. She disguises herself. She sits on the steps of what is known to be a place where prostitutes would be. He sees her with a veiled face, which is some indication to him that she may be a prostitute. They strike a bargain, and he is with her. And again, very interesting that this is a story told in Genesis with no moral insight. No, that was a good thing. That was a bad thing. No, she's not commended for this. She's not condemned for this. It's simply the story that the Bible is telling us.
Yeah, this is narrative. This is telling us this is how it goes. What you might miss for a story like this, if you do bring some of those moral judgments right from the start, you might miss how much agency she's taking in this. She has had her agency stripped away step by step by step by those who should have been taking action on her behalf, not taking it. So now here she takes whatever small strand of agency she has left, and she takes it, and in doing so, this is the amazing deceptive turn of the story, because we've had this theme of deception, particularly within families, all throughout Genesis. Here it comes again. She deceives her father-in-law into laying with her, and in doing so, conceives by him, therefore him fulfilling the commitment that he was directly not taking by this deception he had leveled against her. So she has, through this very strange turn in the story, righted a wrong that he had committed by taking this action, which most of us wouldn't consider an action of positive force. She successfully takes and moves forward in what the text almost shows us to be a constructive way forward. She has established the lineage or the heir of Judah's family, and she's done so through this deception.
Right, and so as the plot unfolds here, Judah sends his servant back with the goat, with the kid, and says, "Go find her, give this to her, get my stuff back." He goes to do that, and he can't find her. And he says, "There's nobody there." And Judah replies, "Let her keep what she has, otherwise we will be laughed at. I sent the kid, and you could not find her." Now, that is not the end of the story. Verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore." Literally true, but he doesn't know that yet. This is sort of almost the Bible's version of maybe a little bit of a dark humor here. Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the whore. Moreover, she is pregnant as a result. And Judah said, "Bring her out, and let her be burned." As she was being brought, she sent word to her father-in-law, "It was the owner of these things that made me pregnant." And she said, "Take note, please, whose they are, the signet, the cord, and the staff." Then Jacob acknowledged them and said, "She is more in the right than I, since I did not give to her my son Shelah." And he did not lie with her again. So she ends up being pregnant. They find out. Judah is outraged. Perhaps he also sees an end to his dilemma, a way out for his son. He says, put her to death, which is standard practice for that, or at least that was the expectation. And she says, "Well, just so you know, this is the father, and it's his stuff." So she springs the trap on him. He's backed into the corner. He now knows what she's done. He probably could have still followed through with it. It's not exactly a threat. It's more like a reminder to do the right thing. But to Judah's credit, she is more in the right than I am. He acknowledges his wrongdoing. Oddly enough, God doesn't seem to strike him dead. Anything. He remains in the covenant and remains in the tribes of Israel. But she has outmaneuvered him. And again, there aren't many places where Scripture celebrates a female doing that, or if celebrate is a strong word, where Scripture even tells a story of that happening. There are a few, but this is one of a rare collection of those.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this story, Clint, is that we find a woman who is making a way in a very difficult circumstance, which I would argue we've seen Genesis characters doing over and over again, particularly in the Jacob generations and everything that follows. What we find here particularly is a woman finding a way where so many of the women thus far have really just sort of been pushed and pulled by the forces that were. Here, Tamar not only stands up to the injustice, she finds a way, but when she pulls out the signet staff at the end, you have what is, in the case of Genesis, the gotcha moment. This is the best of narrative here, because we can imagine that moment where Judah has this sense that he's performing justice by having her meet her end because of this action. And on the way to do it, she proves that he is the father. That this is the text's way of inverting all of our expectations, showing us that she has indeed deceived the deceiver, and reminds us that God has, through the deception of the deceiver, somehow yet continued to work. It's remarkable how cleaned up the version of Genesis is in our children's Bibles. If you've ever read children's Bibles, lots of these stories aren't included, and it's because they're difficult stories, obviously, and I'm not arguing that they should be included, but it is to say, as adults, we can begin to see that the Bible, particularly Genesis, is not afraid of our messy lives. It's not afraid of the struggles that we have. It's aware that people make choices, and sometimes those choices are at the expense of their own interests or expense of those who love them. Somehow, God is still at work in it. And what I think is striking about this story is we're going to have many stories of women who perform actions, not the same as this, but the women who find themselves in this circumstance, and they are not nearly as in power as Tamar is in this story. She's able to invert the order and to assert a thing that should have been done, that the thing that would have been legal and just, she gets through these means. And the Genesis doesn't say that's a good thing, but simultaneously, it doesn't call her out, and it certainly doesn't lead to the end that Judah had intended. So it's a fascinating turn for a story in Genesis, and especially fascinating, last word, especially fascinating bookend between these Joseph stories. I mean, this comes out of left field, and here it is plopped in Genesis, and we try to process it.
We've told you that Middle Eastern literature has a kind of soft spot for shrewdness. Maybe the character of trickster would be too far, but the closest thing I think we've seen to this is Jacob. And so for a story told about a female to mirror in some way the stories told about the patriarch of Israel is interesting, and it is empowering. And just as a final note here, the importance of this story is not yet known. So let me finish it here. When the time came for her delivery, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one put out a hand, and the midwife bound on his hand a crimson thread, saying, "This one was first." But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, "What a breach you've made for yourself." Therefore he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out with the crimson thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. Now, you would have to be a little bit of a Bible student to know this, but Perez, as it turns out, through Judah, is in the lineage of David, and then therefore in the lineage of Christ. So this very messy story gives way to characters that in later story are accounted in the genealogy of both the great king of Israel and ultimately the Messiah. And the fact that that story has this origin is really interesting, that it is celebrated, probably why it is told, probably why it is at some level remembered and maybe celebrated. Because of this woman's courage, her shrewdness, her desperation, whatever combination of things led her to do what she did, we get a character who produces the lineage of both King David and Jesus Christ. And so very, very interesting finish.
It's hard to put this story in a box, Clint. I mean, it is not in a template of a story that we've seen throughout the story thus far. And in some ways, I think you would say that this is an aside that will later become meaningful as the larger story of Israel goes on. So it's important that it's in Genesis. What maybe makes it unique is the fact that this story is not particularly relevant to either the story that preceded it nor follows it. It's here, and it will serve larger functions down the road being in these genealogies. But what we see in this story is very much inherently built into the story itself. You have what you have here. And that is maybe what makes these characters particularly interesting. And I do think, to your point, in Genesis, there's probably not a character who's received as much feminist scholarship as this particular character has. So we engage in this story. We see what's in it. We recognize that the text doesn't moralize it, and so nor do we. We just seek to learn and see how God works even through the actions of those who otherwise have no other power when they find ways to take power, and God makes something of it.
Yeah, interesting characters all the way around, a lot to think about in that text. That will bring us back to the Joseph stories next week. We will cover a lot of ground with Joseph, some very fascinating ground. Hope you can be with us. Thank you for your time today, and we hope to see you again.